I never imagined my morning drive to Hillcrest County would involve seeing newly built villas gleaming in the rising sun, right on top of the marshy grasslands I'd spent years defending. But there they were, row after row of half-finished vacation homes, perched on raised platforms as if the wetlands beneath them existed only to show off some fancy architectural flair. My stomach knotted at the sight of steel beams jutting from a place that had, only months ago, been an untouched habitat for waterfowl, beavers, and rare plant species. It made no sense. This tract of land was under federal and state protection, listed in county records as permanently off-limits to commercial development. And yet, the sign overhead read in bold letters, "Pleasant Shores Villas, luxury living by the water, brought to you by the Holton Ridge HOA." I slammed on the brakes so hard the tires squealed. My heart pounded. I parked on the shoulder just off the main road and stared at the shocking scene. Heavy machinery dotted the once pristine vista, with bulldozers churning up mud that glistened under the early sunlight. Workers in bright vests tromped through the damp earth, hammering away at skeletal frameworks. It looked like the project was well underway, as though they'd broken ground weeks ago. And this wasn't just some small oversight. There were 20-something structures already in various stages of completion. My pulse thundered with a potent mix of anger and disbelief. No one had approached me about any permit, environmental assessment, or special exemption. They'd simply launched this project in the most fragile part of the region, my region. I'm Daniel Pike. On paper, I'm known as the Director of Land Management for this entire county. In practice, that means I'm the guy who ensures developments don't trample protected land or harm critical wildlife habitats. Usually, local HOAs or real estate developers schedule appointments with my office, pitch their grand ideas, and we discuss potential modifications. 9 times out of 10, we find a legal compromise, but no one ever tries to build a massive project on wetlands without so much as a phone call. My job came with the power to impose huge fines, revoke building permits, and if needed, coordinate with state and federal authorities to tear illegal structures down. But from the looks of this site, the Holton Ridge HOA had no idea who I was, or how badly they'd just crossed the line. I hopped out of my car, heart still racing, and waded toward a small construction trailer set up near the edge of the wetlands. Mud squelched beneath my boots, the smell of churned soil filling my nostrils. A couple of workers paused to glance at me, but quickly resumed their tasks. One of them was unspooling a length of chain-link fence, presumably for gating off the property. Another hammered nails into a wooden walkway. Over the low hum of machinery, I heard the faint squawk of displaced waterfowl, probably panicked by the sudden loss of habitat. It stung to think these creatures had nowhere else to go. This land was the only safe haven for miles. I reached the trailer, my knuckles rapping hard on the flimsy metal door. After a beat, it swung open, revealing a woman in her early 40s, wearing a sharp skirt suit and carrying a clipboard. She looked like she'd stepped out of some corporate board meeting, not a muddy construction site. Her eyes flickered with annoyance as she noticed the flecks of mud on my boots, or perhaps the expression of pure outrage on my face. "Can I help you?" she asked, in a clipped tone that suggested she wasn't used to being challenged. I took a measured breath, forced a tight smile. "I'm Daniel Pike, from the county's Land Management Department." I paused, letting that hang in the air. No recognition stirred on her face. "We never granted any permit for this wetlands development, so I'd like an immediate explanation." Her brow arched slightly, though she tried to maintain composure. "My name is Amanda Brooks," she said, adjusting her blazer lapel. "I'm the president of the Holton Ridge Homeowners Association. We're simply expanding our community offerings with a luxury villa project. Everything is in order. You must be mistaken if you think it's unpermitted." She flashed a confident, almost patronizing smile. "Perhaps you should speak with our legal counsel if there's a mix-up." I let out a slow exhale, fighting the urge to snap back. "Ms. Brooks," I said, voice taut with barely contained fury, "this land is designated as protected wetlands under both state and federal guidelines. There is no scenario in which building 23 villas," I gestured at the line of skeleton structures in the distance, "could be legal. I don't recall any environmental impact study crossing my desk. nor any request for a variance, nor any hearing from the zoning board. So you'd better produce official documentation, or you're about to face a serious shutdown. Her grin faltered, though she tried to mask it. We followed our own association's protocols, she replied stiffly, flipping through the clipboard. The property was rezoned privately as part of the Holton Ridge expansions. We consulted with a local surveyor who indicated only minimal environmental constraints. That blatant distortion made my blood boil. Privately rezoned? That's not how rezoning works, I hissed. You can't just declare wetlands free for your use. A local surveyor doesn't overrule county, state, or federal designations. This entire development is trespassing on protected land. Amanda set her jaw, eyes flashing with hostility. I think you should speak with our lawyers. I have a schedule to keep. These villas are already selling pre-construction. People expect them to be done by the end of summer. She turned back into the trailer, effectively dismissing me. My fists clenched, nails digging into my palms. How dare she wave me off? Like I was some powerless bystander? She had no clue I held enough authority to dismantle this entire operation. I stormed away from the trailer, mind churning with next steps. This wasn't my first time dealing with obstinate HOAs, but never had I encountered one so brazen as to break ground on legally protected land. Usually, even unscrupulous developers tried to weasel their way through partial permits, vague legalese, but the Holton Ridge HOA took a wrecking ball to the entire concept of conservation. If they thought my department was just a rubber stamp, they'd learn otherwise soon enough. I returned to my car, already texting a colleague from the Environmental Enforcement Unit. The message read something like, "Massive wetlands violation at Holton Ridge. 23 villas built, W/no permit, need immediate site inspection, possible shutdown." Then I started the engine, adrenaline still pumping. My mind reeled, imagining the ecological damage already done. Wetlands drained, native plants destroyed, water quality compromised. If we didn't act fast, the destruction could become irreversible. Back at the county office, I convened a quick staff meeting, pulling in my deputy director and a couple of environmental inspectors. They stared at me in disbelief as I laid out the situation. "They built how many villas?" one inspector asked, wide-eyed. "On that marsh near Lonsdale Creek?" I nodded. Another staffer cursed under his breath. "That's a designated critical habitat zone," he murmured. "We can't let that stand." I slammed my palm on the table. "Exactly. So let's gather every piece of evidence. We'll file an immediate cease and desist. If the HOA resists, we'll move for an injunction in county court." My deputy frowned. They might have local politicians in their pocket. The Holton Ridge HOA is known for huge budgets, bribing officials for expansions. I inhaled sharply, recalling rumors of shady dealings involving the HOA's previous projects. "So be it," I said. "If they think they can buy their way out, they're wrong. We'll also loop in the State Wetlands Conservation Authority. If we must, we'll bring down federal hammer. I'm not letting them get away with building on these wetlands." A determined gleam passed among my staff. We'd dealt with tricky cases before, but never on this scale. That afternoon, we arrived in 2 county vehicles accompanied by a couple of uniformed enforcement officers. The moment we reached the site, I noticed the tempo of construction had quickened, multiple crews hammering and drilling with frenetic energy, as though they aimed to finish before we shut them down. I approached them, brandishing the cease and desist documents. Ms. Brooks emerged from the trailer again, tension etched into her features. I thrust the papers toward her. "These are official orders to halt all construction immediately," I stated, voice raised enough that the workers could hear. "Any further development will lead to fines and potential demolition of unauthorized structures." Her face clouded with fury. "You can't do that," she snapped, crossing her arms. "We have local approval from our board. This land belongs to Holton Ridge." I snorted. "No local board can override environmental protection laws or county land management authority. If you continue building, you'll face legal consequences." My 2 enforcement officers stepped forward, handing copies of the order to the foreman as well. Ms. Brooks shot them a disdainful glare. Then she turned back to me. "Our lawyers will challenge this. We'll prove we have every right to build here." I forced a brittle smile. I looked forward to reading that argument in court. Meanwhile, your workers must pack up and leave now. She huffed, eyes sparking with malice, but said nothing further. Instead, she barked at the workers to pause. The men set down their tools, glancing around with uneasy expressions. Miss Brooks stomped into the trailer, presumably to call her attorneys. As we headed back to our vehicles, I felt the first flush of triumph. At least we'd put a stop, however temporary, to their destructive project. However, the next day I received a frantic call from one of my inspectors. "Daniel, they're still building," he said, voice tight with anger. "I drove by early this morning. People are hammering away on the villas as if your cease and desist never happened." My stomach lurched. "They're ignoring it entirely?" "Looks like it," he confirmed. "They've doubled the workforce too. Must be trying to outrun the legal process." My anger redoubled. "All right, gather photographic evidence, document the license plates of construction vehicles. We're going to request an emergency injunction from the county judge. This is blatant defiance of an official order." My inspector agreed, already heading to the site with a camera. Meanwhile, I phoned Robert Ingram, a local attorney who specialized in environmental law. I explained the crisis, and he assured me we had a rock-solid case for immediate legal action. "Given your position as Director of Land Management," he said, "the court should fast-track your request. Once we get an injunction, if they still refuse to comply, we can escalate to demolition orders." That same afternoon, we filed the injunction paperwork. The judge scheduled a hearing for the next day, an unusually quick turnaround. Word must have reached Ms. Brooks, because that evening, I got an email from an address reading attorney@HoltonRidge, HOA.com, basically reiterating that they disputed the wetlands classification, claiming private property rights. I slammed my laptop shut, disgusted at their brazen denial of the obvious. Meanwhile, the local news picked up the story, broadcasting images of half-constructed villas in a muddy marsh, with one reporter remarking, "This site appears to violate multiple environmental statutes." On the morning of the hearing, I donned my best suit, though the simmering anger beneath made me feel anything but formal. The courthouse hallway buzzed with tension. Ms. Brooks arrived in a tailored skirt suit flanked by two attorneys in sleek business attire. She shot me a cold glance as we entered the courtroom. My own legal counsel, Robert Ingram, gave me a reassuring nod. We had reams of documentation, official wetlands maps, environmental impact data, and the original designations listing this as a protected habitat. Ms. Brooks' side carried sleek folders, exuding confidence, but I knew the law was on my side. As the judge took the bench, the hearing started with my presentation. We laid out the wetlands classification, the absence of any building permits, the direct violation of the cease and desist, and the ecological harm already visible. Our photos showed the land churned up, water channels blocked, nesting areas destroyed. I hammered home that not only was the HOA building illegally, they were doing so with full knowledge they lacked permission. The judge's eyes narrowed at that detail. Then Ms. Brooks's attorneys spoke, offering a bizarre argument. They claimed the wetlands boundary was outdated, that the property had been privately rezoned through HOA channels, and that their own environmental consultant deemed the land fit for development. I almost snorted in disbelief. The judge cut through their nonsense, asking, "Did you or did you not seek county or state approval for wetlands development?" The attorneys hesitated, then admitted they hadn't obtained formal clearance. The judge's gaze turned steely. By the end of the hearing, it was clear the court sided with us. The judge issued an immediate injunction forbidding further construction and warned Ms. Brooks that ignoring the order again would lead to contempt charges, hefty fines, and potential imprisonment for those responsible. Ms. Brooks tried to maintain a dignified facade, but the tension in her posture spoke volumes. The moment the judge adjourned, she spun on her heel and hurried out, her attorneys trailing in her wake. I felt a wave of relief, yet also a pang of worry. That woman seemed so convinced of her righteousness, it was possible she'd continue building despite the judge's threat. Over the next few days, we posted official stop work placards around the site. My inspectors patrolled daily, ensuring no new materials arrived. Ms. Brooks was nowhere to be seen. The workers had vanished, leaving behind a muddy wasteland of half-finished villas. I spent my time assessing the ecological damage with a team of environmental experts. We discovered that some drainage channels had been filled in, altering the flow of water and threatening to cause floods in nearby neighborhoods if heavy rains fell. Dozens of uprooted marsh plants lay rotting. The smell of disturbed soil and decaying vegetation hung in the air, a testament to how swiftly they'd ravaged what used to be a delicate, balanced ecosystem. Just when we thought the crisis might subside, however, fresh trouble arose. Late one evening, I received a call from a local resident living on the edge of the wetlands. She sounded frantic. "They're pumping water out, Daniel. Some big generator is draining part of the marsh near the villas." My frustration soared. Ms. Brooks or her cronies must have decided to circumvent the injunction by stealth, draining water so they could continue building behind the scenes. Furious, I alerted the county sheriff and drove straight out to the site. Sure enough, at around midnight I found a heavy-duty pump throbbing near the rear portion of the development, spouting water away from the marsh into a makeshift ditch. A single worker loitered nearby, presumably on guard. The moment he saw my headlights, he fled. I approached the machine, shut it down myself, and documented everything. My chest burned with anger at how brazen they were. The next morning I filed a complaint with the judge detailing this blatant defiance of the injunction. A hearing on contempt charges was scheduled within the week. Ms. Brooks attended, looking uncharacteristically flustered. She insisted she had no knowledge of the pump or any continued activity. The judge was unconvinced, pointing out that as HOA president, she was accountable for the site's actions. The judge then levied stiff daily fines on the HOA until they restored the wetlands to pre-construction condition. Ms. Brooks turned ashen, muttering something about an appeal. The judge's gavel came down hard, echoing through the courtroom. Outside, Ms. Brooks cornered me. "You're destroying our investment," she hissed, eyes blazing. "We poured millions into those villas. People have signed contracts. This fiasco will ruin them." My temper flared. "You're the one who built illegally on protected land," I snapped back. "If that means your investment collapses, so be it. You can't break the law and expect a profit." She bared her teeth in a humorless grin. "We'll see about that. We still have allies." Then she stomped off, her heels clacking furiously. I felt a chill run through me. Allies? Perhaps local officials on the take, or wealthy backers who might lean on the county commission. But as the director of land management, I wasn't about to fold. I'd bring in the state and federal agencies if need be. Already, I'd called a contact from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, tipping them off to this fiasco. A site inspection by their team could lead to federal charges if the wetlands were found irreparably harmed, or if endangered species had been displaced. That might be the final blow to Ms. Brooks's arrogant venture. As the weeks rolled on, the daily fines started piling up. The HOA's bank accounts must have been draining, especially since they had no legitimate permit to continue. Meanwhile, the half-built villas sat idle, skeletons rotting in the damp environment, while local news cameras occasionally rolled by to film the bizarre ghost development. I fielded calls from outraged citizens who'd discovered the fiasco on social media. They demanded the county demolish the structures outright. My staff and I explained we had to follow the legal process, but the appetite for swift retribution grew. At one point, Ms. Brooks tried to stage a PR campaign. She organized a press conference near the site, inviting supportive HOA members and a local reporter. She claimed the wetlands were overgrown swampland, that the community was transforming into a scenic haven. I nearly choked on my coffee when I saw the footage. Scenic haven? The local environment was a vital wetland with unique biodiversity, not a wasteland. The subsequent coverage only intensified public ridicule. One environmental activist group erected a protest camp near the villas, brandishing signs that read, "Holton Ridge HOA, Habitat Destroyers." Sensing the rising tide of backlash, Miss Brooks arranged a private meeting with me, presumably to negotiate. My lawyer advised caution, but I agreed, hoping she might finally relent and propose a real plan to restore the land. We met in a neutral conference room at the county offices. Miss Brooks arrived in a crisp suit, flanked by a single attorney. I sat on the opposite side, accompanied by Robert Ingram. She started off with forced cordiality. We're open to a resolution that respects the environment while allowing partial completion of the villas. My eyebrows shot up. Partial completion? Miss Brooks, the entire project stands on illegally disturbed wetlands. You have no authority to keep even one villa. She frowned, biting her lip. But we can't just demolish them. Our community members have invested heavily. Robert cleared his throat, leaning forward. Ms. Brooks, you put them at risk by building illegally. The county and state can't reward your wrongdoing. The most you can hope for is a structured plan to remove the villas and restore the wetlands. If you comply, the fines might be reduced. Otherwise, you face further legal consequences. Ms. Brooks's face reddened, frustration flickering in her eyes. She cast me a scathing glance. You don't know the financial devastation this will cause. People will lose their savings, their dream homes. My temper flared. And what about the countless wildlife that lost their habitat? The local water system compromised by your bulldozers. You prioritized profit over preservation. This was never about dream homes. It was about greed. She stiffened, lips pursed. Silence hung in the air a moment. Then her attorney placed a hand on her arm, quietly advising her. Finally, Miss Brooks spoke through gritted teeth. Fine. We'll consider a partial teardown if we can salvage some of the structures, but we want to keep the rest on any portion that's not officially designated wetland. I almost laughed at the audacity. There is no portion that's not designated wetland. It's all protected. The boundary lines are crystal clear. We have the official maps. You built across the entire area. Her attorney tried to counter that the lines were debatable, but Robert simply shook his head. You can't debate a federally recognized boundary. Ms. Brooks's face fell, though she tried to remain stoic. Then we have no agreement, she snapped, standing abruptly. We'll fight this in higher courts. Robert and I exchanged glances as she and her attorney swept out. That was that. If Ms. Brooks wanted a prolonged legal fight, so be it. We had the evidence, the law, and the mounting public outcry on our side. Over the next few weeks, the situation deteriorated further for the HOA. The daily fines ballooned, local activists demonstrated near the site, and rumors circulated that some of Ms. Brooks's own board members were furious at her reckless approach. One rumor even suggested certain board members planned to oust her from the presidency, hoping to salvage the HOA's finances. Meanwhile, I pressed forward with the state and federal channels. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service conducted their own inspection and concluded the wetlands had been severely disturbed, with potential nesting sites destroyed for a threatened bird species. That triggered federal oversight. Ms. Brooks received a scathing letter demanding immediate remediation or face federal charges. The letter explicitly mentioned that the wetlands were recognized under the Clean Water Act, and that the Army Corps of Engineers might step in if the HOA remained defiant. Strangely, Ms. Brooks kept a low profile after that. No more pompous press appearances or attempts at PR spin. She also failed to pay the continuing fines. The villas remained half-built, increasingly battered by rain and wind. Feral cats slunk among the abandoned construction. My staff documented new signs of environmental havoc: the soil eroding along the edges, water pooling in random spots, algae blooms indicating disrupted water flow. Then, in a dramatic twist, Ms. Brooks re-emerged. She showed up at my office unannounced one late afternoon, looking disheveled, dark circles under her eyes. Gone was the corporate polish and smug aura. She asked if we could speak privately. Against my better judgment, I let her in, though I kept Robert on standby in a next-door room. She settled into a chair, voice subdued. I'm not proud of how things turned out, she began, fiddling with a pen on my desk. We bit off more than we could chew. Our developers assured us this was feasible, that the wetlands classification was outdated. I believed them. I never thought we'd face criminal charges. I listened, arms folded. She sighed. The board is in chaos. Some members blame me for ignoring your warnings. We're nearly bankrupt from fines and legal fees. Investors are backing out. We can't finish the villas, and we can't afford to tear them down. I'm She paused, swallowing. I'm asking for a compromise, a path to rectify this. A swirl of conflicting emotions rose in me. She was definitely the villain who orchestrated this fiasco, but if she genuinely wanted to fix it now, maybe we could minimize further damage. My tone was clipped, but calmer than before. A compromise means you must fully restore the wetlands. All unauthorized structures must go. You'll need a thorough remediation plan working with environmental experts, and you must pay the fines or negotiate with the county to reduce them if you show real compliance. Ms. Brooks nodded, looking defeated. I understand. Our lawyers will draw up a proposal. We just need a chance to stop the bleeding. I gave a curt nod. That's up to the county commissioners and the federal agencies, but if you show good faith, perhaps we can recommend leniency. Your HOA board must commit to the full teardown and remediation. She seemed pained, but she nodded. We have no other choice. The threats of federal charges are real. We'll finalize a plan. With that, she rose and left, her shoulders sagging as though she carried the weight of an entire collapsed dream. Over the next few weeks, the HOA's new stance became clearer. They filed a formal remediation plan promising to demolish all 23 villas. They hired an environmental consulting firm to draft a wetlands restoration blueprint, aiming to replant native species, remove debris, and restore water flow. My staff reviewed the plan, finding it acceptable if implemented properly. The county commissioners convened a final hearing at which Ms. Brooks publicly apologized, though it felt more like a strategic move than genuine regret. The commissioners agreed to reduce some fines if the HOA met strict deadlines for demolition and ecological repair. At last, bulldozers returned to the site, but this time their mission was to tear down the ill-fated villas. Over the course of several weeks, the frames, beams, and concrete slabs disappeared, hauled away by trucks under county supervision. Volunteers from local conservation groups assisted with the replanting effort, sowing seeds of aquatic vegetation, transplanting marsh grasses that could help the wetlands recover. The transformation from chaotic construction zone to carefully restored habitat felt surreal, like an uneasy dream being reversed. Ms. Brooks attended one of the final oversight visits, standing off to the side as crews dismantled the last villa. She looked hollow, possibly haunted by the scale of the fiasco. I approached her, arms crossed. She offered a wan smile. Sometimes I wonder how we got here, she murmured. We wanted a scenic development, never realized we'd cause so much harm. My voice was calm but firm. You cut corners, you refused to do your due diligence. This land was protected for a reason, she nodded, tears glinting in her eyes. I know. I wish we could rewind time. After everything, I felt a sliver of sympathy. Ms. Brooks had gambled and lost, and in the process, nearly destroyed a fragile ecosystem. But at least now, she was paying the price, forced to watch her dream unravel under the force of legal accountability. Eventually, she excused herself, possibly to hide her emotions. I turned my gaze to the newly opened stretch of wetlands, where a small flock of herons had returned. Wading cautiously in the shallow water, my chest swelled with relief. We'd saved it. Maybe not unscathed, but salvageable. Within a few months, the site was clear of all illegal construction, replaced by rows of carefully planted marsh flora. The county and state agencies monitored the land's recovery. The fiasco served as a warning to other ambitious HOAs. Build on protected wetlands, and you'd face swift, crushing justice. The local news concluded its coverage with images of green shoots sprouting from muddy soil, labeling the saga a victory for conservation. I couldn't disagree. In the end, the Holton Ridge HOA nearly went bankrupt from fines and demolition costs. Ms. Brooks resigned her presidency, replaced by more cautious board members who swore never to attempt such a stunt again. Federal environmental officials briefly entertained the idea of pressing criminal charges, but ultimately settled for hefty civil penalties, as the wetlands had a decent chance of full recovery. My department pledged continued oversight, ensuring no future attempts to exploit these marshes would slip under the radar. I stood on the wetland's edge one early morning, weeks after the last villa was torn down. The air felt crisp, the water surface reflecting the dawn sky in gentle ripples. A pair of herons glided overhead, landing gracefully in the shallows. It reminded me why I'd taken this job in the first place. To safeguard these wild, vulnerable spaces from those who saw them only as profit opportunities. Miss Brooks and her HOA might have been wealthy and powerful in their suburban bubble, but they discovered too late that they'd picked a fight with the wrong wetlands and the wrong director of land management. The final irony still lingered in my mind. Had the HOA approached me at the start, seeking a legitimate development plan that respected the environment, maybe we could have found a compromise for some small-scale, eco-friendly housing near the wetlands periphery. But they chose arrogance, forging ahead without permission, certain they could bully or bribe their way past regulations. They built 23 villas on land that belonged more to the birds and fish than to them. They believed themselves unstoppable, but eventually they faced not just me but the entire force of local, state, and federal law. They called it a fiasco. I called it justice. Now, stepping gingerly along a muddy bank, I noticed new growth of cattails, the soft rustle of reeds swaying in a light breeze. A reflection of the morning sun shimmered in the water. The wetlands would endure. Nature could heal if given the chance. My phone vibrated with a text from one of my staff, reminding me of a meeting that afternoon with a different developer who wanted to propose a small nature center on county land. This time they were following every procedure, scheduling an environmental impact review, and actually consulting with my office. I smiled, pocketing the phone. That's how it should be done. Respectfully, responsibly, with no illusions about ignoring the law. Before returning to my car, I let my gaze drift over the wetlands one last time. The place looked calmer, no longer haunted by the skeleton frames of illegal villas. Birds were returning, amphibians croaked in the distance. The fiasco taught me that when push comes to shove, defending the environment can get messy, but the truth and the law stand on the side of those who protect life's fragile edges. If Ms. Brooks or anyone else tried something like this again, I'd be ready to defend these marshes all over. Because the Holton Ridge HOA learned a painfully expensive lesson. They built 23 villas on my protected wetlands, and once they found out I was the powerful director of land management, they were about to face justice. And face it, they did. For in this county, wetlands aren't just property lines on a map. They're living sanctuaries, and messing with them brings consequences you can't simply buy your way out of.